Sorry.
The SBT people are coming to tell us about Hall's Croft, about the restoration, about what they're doing, about what happened when somebody reversed it, all that. So, if you're interested at all in Hall's Croft, I know it's my favourite Shakespeare building. Let's come along and support the SBT in all their endeavours, because apparently in the 60s when it was restored, they put things like asbestos in them and stuff like that. Right. Do you really want an historic building? They didn't lose any investment. So anyway, tonight, John Richards. John and I first met when we were digging Shakespeare's garden, looking for spoils in the archaeology department. I don't think we found anything.
Nothing too exciting.
Yeah, no. Anyway, so John is going to talk to us about one of our famous kings. We all know about Richard III. He did all sorts of horrible things like killing the princes in the tower and all that sort of stuff. And John is either going to say yes, he did all right, or he's going to say no, he was really So without more ado, I'll get out of the way and I'll sit down and John can tell you all about the life and times of Richard III.
Well, good evening. Thank you all for coming along. It's good to see one or two familiar faces. Nearly said old faces then. Familiar faces. Yes, I'm John Richards, and this evening we are going to have a little chat about King Richard III. He is one of our more recognisable kings, certainly one of our more controversial, and one of our better known ones. Which is curious because he was only king for just over 2 years. And during his reign, there were no big social upheavals, no big natural catastrophes like a plague, and no big wars. Although there was one significant battle that was fought on the very last day of King Richard's reign, 22nd of August, 1485, the Battle of Bosworth. Now that gives Richard his first claim to fame, that of being the last king of England to die on the battlefield. Another reason why he is so well known is that that chap Shakespeare, he wrote a play about him. Now, Shakespeare's creation, his character, has been portrayed on stage and on screen by people like Kevin Spacey, Benedict Cumberbatch, Ian McKellen, Sir Laurence Olivier. They have all followed Shakespeare's creation, this character, this malevolent hunchback with a withered arm and one leg shorter than the other, somebody who goes lurching about the stage, leaving a trail of dead bodies behind him. And it is portrayals like this that have helped fix this impression we have of Richard in the imagination of the public. Another claim to fame, or perhaps I should say notoriety, is that he is inextricably linked with the disappearance of the princes in the Tower. His nephews, the two young sons of Richard's elder brother, King Edward IV. Placed in the royal apartments in the Tower of London, under Richard's protection, they disappear, never to be seen again. And it is true that a lot of time and effort has been expended recently trying to exonerate Richard, to say it was not him what done it. But we do not have sufficient hard evidence that would stand up in a court of law and secure a conviction. What we do have is a mountain full of circumstantial evidence that, at the very least, will ensure that the finger of accusation remains pointed at Richard. one more claim to fame that he once had, past tense, and that he was the only king, the only ruler we have, who had no known grave. Most of our kings and queens are in Westminster Abbey or Windsor, some are dotted around some cathedrals, a couple are in France, a couple we know roughly where they were buried, but we don't have an exact grave site. Now, Richard, following his death at Bosworth, his body was taken to Leicester, buried with the Greyfriars. That establishment was closed down during the dissolution of the monasteries. His grave was despoiled, and there is a story, and it does appear in a lot of history books, that his remains were exhumed and dumped into the local river, washed away, lost and gone. No known grave. Now, all that changed a couple of years ago. Well, they found him buried in the middle of Leicester underneath a car park. Bury me under a car park over my dead body. His remains were exhumed, subjected to quite intense scientific investigation. Taught us a lot about Richard, his lifestyle, and in particular, the way in which that life came to an end. We'll be having a look at some of that evidence later, focusing on how Richard met his end. The man himself, he was very much a man of his time, born in 1452. He was the youngest son of one Richard, Duke of York, man of royal descent, very powerful man, a man who would have made a good king. He had a good, strong claim to the throne, but that throne was already occupied by Henry of Lancaster, King Henry VI, one of the most inept and disastrous kings that we've ever had. Henry was king when he was only 9 months of age, so he's not really age qualified for the job. The country had to be governed by a committee. The Duke of York, Richard of York, was nominated as Lord Protector. But when Henry grew older, it was discovered he had what today would be called issues. It looks as if he suffered with catatonic schizophrenia. He was a wishy-washy individual anyway, but every so often he would just switch off. Not pass out, not be comatose, be fully awake, but totally incapable of feeding himself, dressing himself, looking after himself. Not the sort of individual you would want sitting on the throne of a turbulent kingdom. So the kingdom was governed by this committee. Some of the committee supported Henry of Lancaster, Henry VI, the Red Rose. Some of them supported Richard of York, the White Rose. And splits and divisions occurred, so much so that the country slipped into this 30-year phase we know as the Wars of the Roses, armed conflict, during which the pendulum of success swung backwards and forwards. Richard of York, he was killed at the Battle of Wakefield, one of the very early battles in the wars. And the Yorkist cause was taken up by his son, Edward, not a man to be trifled with. Edward was about 6'4" tall, powerful, strong, brave, courageous, a leader of men. And he led the Yorkists to some stunning victories. So much so that Henry VI was captured, placed in the royal apartments in the Tower of London, not imprisoned, but in the royal apartments. Well, he was quite happy to bide his time. And Edward of York had himself crowned King Edward IV. There was a phase in our history where England had 2 kings. And then the pendulum swung against Edward. There was a bit of a Lancastrian revival. Edward was forced to leave the country, to live in exile. With him went his youngest brother, Richard, by now Duke Richard of Gloucester. Richard's motto is "Loyalty binds me," and he was loyal, true and faithful to his big brother, Edward IV. After a couple of months in exile, the brothers returned, raised an army, and went looking for the Lancastrians. The two sides clashed first, 1471, at Barnet, just north of London. This was Richard's first taste of battle. He was 18 years old. It was a victory for the Yorkists. We are told that Richard fought well, fought bravely. There's one letter that suggests he received a wound. We can't confirm that. The most notable casualty at Barnet was one Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, Warwick the Kingmaker, the most powerful man in the country. He died leading the Lancastrian army. And on the day that Barnet was fought, a second Lancastrian army took to the field. This one came over from France, headed by Margaret of Anjou, the wife of the imprisoned Henry VI. They landed on the south coast, and the intention was for Margaret's army to meet up with Warwick's army to combine and make a big army. Barnet changed all that, so instead Margaret led her forces through the West Country with the intention of crossing the River Severn to Wales, where there was a lot of support for the House of Lancaster. The lowest bridging point of the river is the city of Gloucester, and that city declared for the Yorkists. They closed their gates to Margaret's army. Her forces were forced to move up the east bank of the River Severn to the next crossing point, Tewkesbury. It was at Tewkesbury on the 4th of May, 1471, that Edward's army caught up with them. The Lancastrians took up a defensive position just south of the town on a little ridge of high ground, give them a bit of a height, elevation, good advantage. And in front of the ridge, there was a lot of broken ground, ditches, hedges, not the sort of place you would want to lead soldiers into, natural defensive barrier. Now Richard, our Richard, could see this with an astute soldier's eye. He read the land. He knew it was not a good idea to send his men into these ditches, hedges. But he could also see the flags, the banners of the leader of the Lancastrian army, the Duke of Somerset, on the ridge just in front of him. So instead of sending his men forward into the attack, he sent forward his archers, his artillerymen, his handgunners, told them, aim for those flags. They gave the Duke of Somerset his very own personal bombardment, which unsettled him just a little bit. So much so, Somerset sent his men down from the ridge into this broken ground to get at Richard. They emerged not as one sort of solid, cohesive fighting force, but they broke in a broken formation. And not only did the formation break up, but instead of coming out facing Richard, they came out at an angle, facing Edward, and Edward went for them. Richard led his men into the flank. Some other soldiers mounted on horses nipped around the back, and the Lancastrian army began to crumble. The whole of the Lancastrian line broke up. A lot of Lancastrians fled towards the river where they were caught. And today, just south of Tewkesbury, there is an area that bears the name Bloody Meadow, where the Lancastrians were slaughtered. Some of the Lancastrian nobility sought sanctuary in Tewkesbury Abbey. They were either hunted down and killed in the Abbey church, or they were dragged out and later executed in Tewkesbury marketplace. That was the fate of the Duke of Somerset, the leader of the army. The most notable casualty at Tewkesbury was one Edward, Prince of Wales, the only son and heir of Henry VI. He died at Tewkesbury. Just over a week later, we know Edward IV was in London. His brother Richard was with him. Henry VI is in the Tower of London. And we know that on the 21st of May, Richard was in the Tower of London. In the morning, Henry VI was dead. The official line is, on learning of the defeat of two of his armies, the death of his only son, the capture of his wife, he pined away and died of melancholy, died of a broken heart. When they were taking his body for burial, it leaked a lot of blood. Somebody who's died of melancholy doesn't leak a lot of blood. Somebody who's died of multiple stab wounds does. It looks as if he was killed on the orders of King Edward IV, a deed that was supervised and may even have been undertaken by Richard of Gloucester. With Henry out of the way, the Lancastrian force was spent. Edward settled down to about a decade of relative peace. He had taken a wife, a lady named Elizabeth Woodville. A lot of people didn't like her. She was from the lower aristocracy. And as soon as she became queen, she started appointing her family to positions of authority above the heads of the established aristocracy, which their noses out of joint. She also began seeding the aristocracy with lots of Woodvilles, lots of arranged marriages. A young lad in his 20s would be married to some lady in her late 60s, so that when she popped her clogs, he would inherit the dukedom. All these things were arranged. So Richard could see this happening. And he didn't get on particularly well with the Woodvilles and with Elizabeth in particular. So he kept out of the way. He withdrew from court. And Richard himself married. The lady he married was one Anne Neville. She was the younger daughter of Richard Neville, Warwick the Kingmaker, who had died fighting against Richard at Barnet. Anne was also the widow of Edward, Prince of Wales, who had died fighting against Richard at Tewkesbury, which meant she was also the daughter-in-law of King Henry VI, who died in the Tower of London, probably killed by Richard. No, she still married him. They were very happy. They produced one son, a lad called Edward. Lots of Edwards, aren't there? They were very happy together. Withdrew from court. Richard spent a lot of his time in his estates in the north of England, where he was highly respected by the local people, and he still is today. They respected him as a governor, a leader. He looked after his people. Edward still called on him occasionally. He'd visit court, and on one occasion, the Scots had been giving a lot of trouble, crossing the border, raiding. Edward asked Richard to go north and sort them out. So he did. Richard led an army over the border. They captured the town of Berwick-on-Tweed, went on to capture Edinburgh. Edinburgh Castle held out though. And Richard, again, with a soldier's eye, realised it would take a long time, a lot of effort, cost a lot to capture the castle for very little gains. So he said, nah, leave them, let's go back. He went back in triumph and lived happily until early 1483, when King Edward IV unexpectedly died. Not to panic, he produced a brood of children, including 2 sons. He had secured the succession. The elder of these 2 boys, yet another Edward, was immediately proclaimed King Edward V. Now, the young Edward was in Ludlow Castle when his father died. He had to travel from Ludlow to London for the coronation. Now, Richard of Gloucester, our Richard, he was appointed Lord Protector, while the 12-year-old Edward, until he reached his majority. Richard was pushed into a very awkward position. He didn't get on with the Woodvilles, kept out of their way, and he knew that if the young Edward were to be crowned, the young lad, the young king, could be manipulated by his mother, Elizabeth Woodville, the Woodville clan. He felt vulnerable. He was worried for his own safety, for his family. Richard had to react, and react he did, rather sharply. He intercepted the young Edward and his party on their way to London. The young Edward was being escorted by some of his Woodville uncles. Richard had them arrested, sent north, imprisoned in one of Richard's castles, where they were later executed without trial. Richard was acting outside the law. The young Edward was taken to London, placed in the royal apartments for his own safekeeping in the Tower of London. He wasn't imprisoned, he was living in the royal apartments. Elizabeth Woodville and her daughters fled into sanctuary in Westminster Abbey. She could feel what was going on. A little later, she was persuaded to release her second son to join his brother in the Tower. Richard of Gloucester, Lord Protector, had the two princes safely incarcerated in the Tower. And then plans for the coronation were still going ahead. The council would meet every so often. One member of the council was William, Lord Hastings. He'd fought with Richard at Tewkesbury and at Barnet, friend of Richard. Hastings wanted the coronation to go ahead as soon as possible. And there was one incident, council meeting. Richard stood up and accused Hastings of treason. Armed men who'd been waiting outside entered the council chamber. There was a fight, sword fight. People were wounded. Hastings was dragged off outside and executed. Again, without trial. Richard was acting outside the law. You can imagine the council chamber when Richard came back in. Right, anybody else want to disagree with me? Plans for the coronation still going ahead. But then a priest delivered a sermon outside St. Paul's Cathedral, and he announced that King Edward IV, father of the princes, was illegitimate. His father, the Duke of York, wasn't his real father, which meant the princes in the Tower were also illegitimate. Because they were illegitimate, they were not allowed to become king. Now, Edward IV's mother was still alive at the time, so you can imagine what she had to say about that. And in general, the people just disbelieved it. No, it's can't be true. And that one fell flat. But at about the same time, the Bishop of Bath and Wells, a chap called Stillington, he announced, okay, Edward IV was legitimate, but he had already been married to a lady called Elizabeth Butler before he married Elizabeth Woodville, which meant his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was bigamous, illegal. Any issue of that marriage were illegitimate, the princes in the Tower, and therefore they were ineligible to become king. And the people believed that one. So the princes were excluded from the royal succession. That only left one person who could succeed, Richard of Gloucester, who became King Richard III. All through that summer, there were plots, real and imagined, to spring the princes out of the Tower. We don't know exactly what was going on at the time. We know Edward V, the elder of the princes, was a sickly lad. He may have died of natural causes. We don't know. There is a theory that his brother, younger brother, the second prince, Richard, he escaped, went off to do other things. We don't know. But there was a definite plot to free them. Install the young Edward as king, get rid of Richard III. Richard found out about it. He knew those princes were a complication. All through that summer, the princes were seen less and less. They were moved from the royal apartments into accommodation deeper in the Tower. Their servants were gradually replaced by Richard's people. One of the last ones to leave, the prince's personal physician, he put pen to paper, pen to parchment. He wrote down that he was genuinely concerned about the safety of the princes, their health. their safety. And then in the autumn, 1483, bombshell exploded. Word got out, the princes were dead, killed on the instructions of King Richard III. And this seismic shock spread across London, across the country. It reached the royal courts of Europe. We have documentary evidence of people on the continent aghast at what had happened in England. Exactly what happened, we just do not know. The princes have been seen less and less. They disappeared. Might have gone off to live somewhere else. I don't know. But anyway, it is interesting that when all this hubbub was going on, King Richard, he was out of London at the time. The best story we have that covers this period was written by Sir Thomas More, 30, 40 years after the event. More was only 5 years old when the princes disappeared. But More would have spoken with people who were alive at the time. And More tells us that King Richard III enlisted the help of Sir James Tyrrell. James Tyrrell, he was knighted a bit later. And Tyrrell used a couple of thugs to enter the Tower of London. Tyrrell was given the keys to the tower for one night only. He and these thugs went into the tower. The heavies went into the royal bedchamber, bundled the two princes up in their bedding and smothered them in their pillows. That's about the closest account we have of what happened to the princes. More's account, there are lots of flaws in it. People have questioned it, but there is a lot of specific detail in it. He also tells us that after the deed was done, the princes were buried in the tower, deep in the ground, under a big pile of stones at the foot of a staircase. A couple of hundred years later, during the reign of Charles II, some men were doing some work in the tower, and at the foot of a staircase, deep in the ground, under a pile of stones, they found two skeletons. Those bones were examined, and Charles II had them interred in an urn in Westminster Abbey. The bones were examined in the 1930s. Indeterminate gender, two young people, about 10 and 12 years old, matched the age of the princes. They're still in that urn in Westminster Abbey now. And we know Queen Elizabeth II said, no, we don't touch them. King Charles, our King Charles now, apparently he's amenable for the bones to be investigated. So if he can extract some DNA, we will know one way or the other whether those bones belong to the princes or not. Richard's reaction to all this, there wasn't one. He said nothing. He did nothing. I mean, it is a natural human reaction. If you get a letter through the post saying you've been caught speeding, the first thing you say is, oh no, surely not, denial. You say to a small child, did you do so? No, it wasn't me. It's almost instinctive, knee-jerk reaction. No, it was not me. And Richard said absolutely nothing, total silence in face of all this accusation, which in a way does say quite a lot. And all Richard needed to do to dispel all these rumours was to produce the princes, take them for a walk around London, take them down to McDonald's or something, show the people, look, they're still alive. He couldn't, because the princes were no longer with us. Shortly afterwards, tragedy struck a bit closer to home. Richard's own son, Edward, died. He and Anne were distraught. A little while later, his wife, Anne, she died. Richard's best mate, the Duke of Buckingham, somebody who'd helped him to the throne, rose in revolt against Richard. We don't exactly know why. Some people suggested it was in disgust at what he'd done to the princes. We don't know. The Buckingham revolt fizzled out. Buckingham was arrested, taken to Salisbury, executed. Again, without trial. Richard was working outside the law. Richard himself was becoming increasingly isolated and vulnerable. And that vulnerability was picked up by one of the last surviving heirs of the House of Lancaster, a chap called Henry Tudor. He'd been forced to leave the country fled. He was born in Pembroke Castle, taken abroad by his uncle for his own safety. He lived in Brittany. Richard knew about this and tried to have him extradited and brought to England. When Richard was king, he sent men over to Brittany to nobble Henry. Henry managed to escape by the skin of his teeth, went to live in France. The French king decided to help him, and in 1485, Henry Tudor, with an army of a lot of French mercenaries, a lot of Lancastrian supporters, a lot of supporters of the House of York, who had defected, left Richard, and changed sides to support Henry. They all landed on the coast of South Wales. Henry then marched his army through Wales. That part of the country was under the control of a chap called Rhys ap Thomas, member of the lower aristocracy. That was his responsibility, that part of the world. Rhys ap Thomas had sworn fealty to King Richard III. His sympathies lay with Henry Tudor. And as Henry Tudor marched through Wales, Rhys ap Thomas shadowed him. He didn't attack him, shadowed him. The two men met near Welshpool. And there's a lovely story that we cannot corroborate. It is a lovely story that, Rhys ap Thomas had promised the king, an enemy will only enter the country over my dead body. So he lay down. Henry Tudor stepped over his body, and Rhys ap Thomas got up, and the two of them went on together to fight. There's lots of variations of that story, but it's a good tale. Anyway, they crossed the River Severn at Shrewsbury, marched eastwards to confront Richard. Richard knew what was happening. He disassembled an army at Nottingham, transferred them to Leicester, moved from Leicester westwards to confront the rebel army on his way to him. In those days, men rode horses to battle. Rode a horse, you rode it. If not, you walked. They dismounted and fought on foot. The days of the great cavalry charges of armoured knights coming to an end. People dismounted to fight on foot. Men would wear as much armour protection as they could afford, could acquire, starting off with a helmet and maybe a breastplate, backplate, bits and pieces. A full suit of armour was hideously expensive. It was only people like kings and dukes could really afford decent full body armour. Because men were clad in armour, they no longer had to carry shields. So the big, heavy kite shields of the Middle Ages left those behind. Some men carried smaller shields. Men fought on foot. Long range projectile weaponry, bows and arrows, artillery. Artillery had been used for about 250 years. Handguns. Most weapons were short range weapons. Things like little daggers like this. This is called a rondel dagger because of the disc on the back of the handle. And the idea was you'd hold it like this, handle there, and thrust forward. It's a long, thin weapon, two sharp edges and a needle-sharp point. This was designed to winkle out the weak spots in the armour, slide in between two overlapping plates of armour to gain entry through the bits that couldn't be covered with plate armour, places like the armpits. And this is where all the men go, ooh, up between the legs. Also, it was a recognised way to dispatch a foe, was to go in through the eye. Yes, the brain is encased in the thick bone of the cranium, but at the back of the eyeball, the eye socket, the bone is comparatively thin. So a thrust was something like this, through the vision slot of the helmet, through the eye, through the bone, straight into the brain. It was a recognised way to dispatch a foe. An extension, literally, of the dagger, sword like this, long and thin. The days of the great two-handed, heavy, slashing away Middle Ages sword, they'd come to an end. People use things like this. Again, like the dagger, sharp point, giving you a lot of range find the weak spots in the armour, two cutting edges, which could do a lot of damage in a blow like that. Most men would use no plastic tubes, but a pole weapon like this. This is called a halberd. Some of these are about 6-7 foot long. At one end, you have a butt spike. This could be used offensively. It could also mean that you could stick the halberd in the ground, so you didn't have to find something to lean it up against. You couldn't lie it down and trip over it. It was there ready, so you could just hang it out, have a fag waiting for the battle to start, and then pick it up and away to go. The business end is up here. You've got this spike. This was a stabbing, penetrating weapon. And a spike like this, delivered with sufficient force, did punch its way through plate armour. The other element here is cutting edge. It's like an axe. Something like this, swung with two hands and brought down on an opponent's head. Even if you had a helmet on, it cut through the helmet. Cutting edge weapon. The third element here is this hook. Now, people have said this hook could be used to hook a mounted knight out of his saddle, pull him out of the saddle onto the ground, and then finish him off. But most men, as I said, fought on foot. So this equally could be used to hook an opponent's legs from underneath him, and once he was down, finish him off. Multi-purpose weapon. So the two armies faced up to each other, just across the border from Warwickshire into Leicestershire, Bosworth Field. You had the Royal Army of King Richard, the rebel army of Henry Tudor. There was a third army in the field, though, led by the Stanley brothers. Now, the Stanleys, a very powerful family, they brought on a couple of thousand soldiers, significant contribution to anybody's army. The Stanleys had sworn allegiance to King Richard. Secretly, they supported Henry Tudor. They met Henry Tudor the evening before the battle. We don't know what they talked about, but you can imagine what it was. One of the Stanleys was married to Henry Tudor's mother. You can imagine what she would have to say if things went against her son. So the Stanleys were there, but were reluctant to commit themselves. So they had this triangular sort of arrangement. Henry's army, Richard's army, and the Stanleys. Battle of Bosworth. Exchange of archery, artillery, and the two sides moved in together. Henry's army attacked Richard's army. Now, Richard's army had something like a 3-to-1 superiority. But Henry had spoken to the Stanleys the evening before. A lot of Richard's army, some of his men, had defected to Henry Tudor, before the battle. Richard knew they'd gone. One element of Richard's army, led by the Earl of Northumberland, they held back. They sat out the whole battle on the sidelines, didn't get involved. Afterwards, they just wandered off. They didn't fight. The bit of Richard's army that did engage fought reluctantly, and against all the odds. They were being pushed back. Now, Richard could see this. He knew his men weren't fighting as they should. He knew elements of his army weren't joining in. He knew he was losing it. He could see he was going to lose the battle. But he could also see, in the distance, the flags and the banners. Henry Tudor. He knew where Henry was. And he gambled. He gathered together a group of armoured knights, one of the last great cavalry charges of the Middle Ages. He led his men forward. They skirted around the main battle area and went straight for Henry Tudor. Henry Tudor was on foot, and he could see this massive cavalry coming towards him. He could see what was coming at him. And Richard almost pulled it off. Henry Tudor's standard bearer, Sir William Brandon. Richard killed him. Now, a standard bearer, his job was to stand right next to his liege lord. That's how close Richard came. Another one of Henry's men is Sir John Cheney, giant of a man. He's almost 7 foot tall. He rode in to intercept Richard. Richard had him out of the saddle on the ground. John Cheney survived. But then several factors happened at once. Richard's charge lost a lot of impetus. Henry's supporters could see what was going on, and they closed ranks around Henry, held up their halberds, their spears, their pikes, formed a defensive cordon. Some of Henry's men came in to attack Richard, and then the Stanleys joined in on Henry's side, slammed into the side of Richard's lot. Richard's horse shied away into some marshy ground and was bogged down. Richard was thrown from the saddle. He emerged from the marsh, soaking wet, covered in mud, isolated, alone, on foot. His enemies closed in and killed him. We know very little of what happened to him. All the chronicles we have, even the ones who are totally hostile towards Richard, they all concur. He died fighting bravely, like a king, like a man. The most detailed account we've got was from a Burgundian chronicler called Jean Molyneux. And he said, King Richard was killed by a Welshman with a halberd. And that's it. That's all we have. Apart from a poem that was written by a Welshman called Gitto Glyn. Wonderful name. It's a poem that praises Rhys ap Thomas. And in that poem, this very mysterious line, it says it was Rhys ap Thomas who killed the boar and shaved his head. Now, the boar was Richard's badge. Shaved his head? Did this Welsh guy scalp him or something? You know? But because that poem was written in Welsh, which would be inaccessible to most people, because it was a work of literature, not a valid historical source, and because of that enigmatic line, shaved his head, that source has been largely ignored. Now then, after Richard fell, his crown was found in a thorn bush, presented to Henry Tudor. Try that on, Henry. Oh, look, it fits right. You've got the job. King Henry VII. Richard's body, we are told, was stripped of armour and clothing, bundled naked onto a horse, taken into Leicester and hurriedly buried with the Greyfriars. His body was on display in Leicester for a couple of days so people could see, yes, it was him, and yes, he was dead. Greyfriars closed during the dissolution of the monasteries. Richard's grave disappeared. Now, all that changed in 2012, when underneath that car park in Leicester, they found his remains. The car park was owned by Leicester City Council, Social Services Department. Cruel irony, Department of Child Welfare. Richard was buried under a parking lot marked with a big letter R. Not for Richard, but for reserved. The archaeologist dug a trench. The first human remains they found were lower leg bones. The feet and the ankles were missing. Not because Richard had been defeated in battle, but in the 1800s, somebody dug a trench through and they swiped his feet off inadvertently. They worked their way up to the legs, and then, still cringe when I recall this, one of the archaeological team was an osteoarchaeologist, a bone expert, but she was lending a hand with a mattock to clear some of the spoil away. And clunk, she found a skull. So it must be another skull, it must be two bodies there. But no, the body had been buried in a sitting position. The grave was too small, the body was sitting up. So the skull was much higher than the leg bones, and she found it with her mattock smashed in the left side of the skull. Oops. After that, the archaeologists carried on a little more cautiously, uncovered the body. There was the skeleton, in a sitting position in a small grave. Two things were noticed. Firstly, the hands were crossed in the lap, suggesting those hands had been tied together. Also, there was a significant curvature of the spine, a condition known as scoliosis that comes on in adolescence. Now we know King Richard had one shoulder higher than the other. That has been confirmed by accounts from the time. And some of Richard's portraits, painted from life, have been x-rayed, and you can see where they've been adjusted, adulterated, painted over to level his shoulders off. The person whose skeleton that was would have had one shoulder higher than the other. Also, the scoliosis would have meant that that individual would have, let's say, carried one arm a little bit awkwardly. He may, and they can't decide upon this one, he may not have had a limp, but he may have dragged his foot slightly. Shakespeare's creation was a hunchback with a withered arm and one leg shorter than the other. Total fabrication, total propaganda, based on facts that would have been known about Richard and his slightly asymmetrical appearance. The skeleton was removed from the ground, sent off to the lab, intense forensic medical scientific examination. It told us a lot about Richard's life, his lifestyle, his diet. It told us, when it was carbon-14 dated, that that skeleton fitted King Richard's time. But even more important, they were able to extract some DNA. This is the mitochondrial DNA that goes down the female line. They found some of Richard's female descendants. DNA samples were taken, and there was an almost perfect match. Bingo! It was King Richard III. Now, as well as all this other information, the skeleton also told us a lot about how that man died. A number of wound marks were located on the bones. Any evidence of damage to soft tissue just hadn't survived. It had all rotted away. But there were scars, wound marks on the bones. All those wound marks, apart from two, were on the skull. Now we know Richard went into battle, full suit of armour with a helmet. The two wound marks below the neck were both post-mortem, occurred after death. Richard's armour had done its job. It had protected his body. The first of those wound marks was on the right-hand side. It had been caused by a dagger. After Richard had died, somebody slid the dagger in between the plates of armour to locate the securing strap, to cut the strap so the armour could come off. The second wound mark was in an amazing place. It was inside the pelvic girdle. It had been caused by the point of a dagger. The dagger had chipped the bone inside the pelvis in a position that was virtually impossible to get at. If the man had been on horseback, or even if he'd been standing up, impossible to get at. But we know Richard's body, stripped naked, thrown over the back of a horse, head and arms dangling down one side, legs the other side. And when he was in that vulnerable and very undignified position, somebody came up behind and stabbed him in the right buttock. The blade penetrated the flesh into the pelvis and caused that little chip mark inside the pelvic girdle. It's what we call a humiliation wound. It's like chopping off an enemy's head, that sort of thing, you know. The other wound marks were all on the skull. Now we know that when Richard went into battle, he was wearing a helmet. So for those wound marks to have been placed on his skull, that helmet would needed to have come off. So if we can use that as a starting point, we can look at the wounds on his skull and work out a rough sequence of what had happened. Now I have brought along to show you a replica of King Richard's skull. It's made of plastic, it's okay. The tooth had been lost in life. that is not a battle injury. I haven't included on this skull the damage done by the archaeologist Mattock, which was in this area along here. So Richard, he's on foot. His enemies are closing in. He's wearing a helmet. That helmet needs to come off. And it looks as if a right-handed assailant came up behind him, grabbed him around the head, around the helmet, and then inserted a dagger up under the rim of that helmet to find the chin strap, sever the chin strap, remove the helmet. There is a little nick just there on the angle of the lower jawbone, probably caused by the point of the dagger. I'm not absolutely certain about that one. But what we have, that we are certain about, there's a very definite cut mark just there on the lower front jaw, where that dagger went in and cut into the jaw. What we don't know is the soft tissue damage to the side of Richard's face. But his cheek, his face must have been cut up something horrible. Anyway, the chin strap was severed, the helmet came off. The quickest way to dispatch a foe was to go in through the eye, through the thin bone at the back, into the brain. And this is what appears to have happened. The attacker standing behind him, dagger in his right hand, stabbed backwards like this. It may have been a second attacker coming in from the front. We don't know. The fellow standing behind, stab like this, doesn't have much force to it. He can't see what he's aiming for. And of course, he's stabbing back towards himself. He's going to get wary where that point was going to go. Instead of hitting the eyeball, he missed. And the point of the dagger went into the right cheek, just there. It penetrated the bone, but not into the brain. Nasty wound, painful, uncomfortable, but survivable. Now at this time, Richard, soaking wet, covered in mud, perspiration, he's now covered with a lot of slippery blood. He's thrashing about. He's on an adrenaline high. He's literally fighting for his life. And the fellow with the dagger behind him might have been a second man, we don't know. The fellow standing behind him, you can almost sense the panicky desperation now, stabbed downwards onto the top of Richard's head, just here. The point of the dagger penetrated the skull. It detached two little flakes of bone from the inside of the skull, and the point of the dagger would have touched the brain. That was not a fatal wound. Richard could have survived that. He didn't have any infection, septicemia. He could well have survived that wound. But the force of the impact, the fact that the dagger had touched the brain, would have more or less caused him to lose consciousness. He'd still be awake, but dizzy, woozy. There are accounts that he fell to his knees in prayer. No, he fell to his knees because he'd been stunned by the dagger. And when he was down, somebody else waded in, maybe with a sword, probably with a halberd, and they whacked him on the back of the head, just here. That edged weapon sliced off this little elliptical shape of bone. It was never found. It's probably still out there somewhere in a farmer's field in Leicestershire. There are a couple of little marks next to it. It looks, we don't know, but possibly there were several blows, or maybe the one blow jutted across. We don't know, but it was a severe blow, removed this piece of bone, and also would have removed a large piece of soft tissue, the scalp, that would have been sliced away as well. Again, a non-fatal injury. Richard would have survived this. But again, the impact of the blow was such, he was knocked out, virtually unconscious, fell forward onto his hands and knees. And then the fellow with the halberd hit him again. This time on the back of the parietal bone here, the occipital bone, beg your pardon, the occipital bone here. That blow sliced off a circular piece of bone like this. This piece of bone was found with Richard's skeleton, which tells us it was still attached to the head with a piece of soft tissue, a piece of scalp. That blade also cut into the brain. If Richard didn't die at the point of impact, he would have died very shortly afterwards. But it wasn't over there yet. On his hands and knees, he rolled over onto his back, his head upright. And then somebody else, not with a halberd, this time with a sword, waded in and stabbed downwards. The point of the sword pierced the bone just here. The sword went in under the jaw, through the mouth, through the soft palate, through the bone, through the brain, and made a little chip mark on the inside of the cranium. That was a fatal wound. So Richard received 2 fatal blows. Thus died King Richard III. But who actually killed him? Now, that Burgundian chronicler, Jean Molyneux, tells us it was a Welshman with a halberd. That's all we have. But then we have that Welsh poem by Guto Glyn. Tells us that Rhys ap Thomas killed the boar, Richard, and shaved his head. The back of Richard's head had literally been shaved off. So looking at all the evidence, the historical evidence of the chronicles, the archaeological evidence of the skull, that poem, put it all together, and that evidence would suggest it was indeed Rhys ap Thomas killed him. After the battle, Rhys ap Thomas was knighted, became Sir Rhys ap Thomas. A little later, he was admitted to the prestigious Order of the Garter. He was given lots of land and authority in southwest Wales. Wealthy, powerful man. He continued to serve Henry VII. Henry VII used to refer to him as Uncle Rhys. He gets a mention in Shakespeare's Richard III. He doesn't get a part, but he is mentioned as Rhys ap Thomas. After Henry VII died, Rhys ap Thomas continued to serve his son, Henry VIII. Rhys ap Thomas died in 1525, and he was buried in the Welsh town of Carmarthen, in the priory of the Greyfriars.
Yeah.
The same monastic order that accepted Richard in Leicester, accepted Rhys ap Thomas in Carmarthen. Now, when those 2 establishments were closed during the Reformation, the dissolution of the monasteries, Richard's tomb in Leicester was despoiled. Rhys ap Thomas, his tomb was moved from the Greyfriars and his remains with it and installed in St. Peter's Church in the middle of the town of Carmarthen, where you can see it today. Big alabaster tomb, effigy on top, his grave, a monument to Rhys ap Thomas, the Welshman with a halberd who killed King Richard III. Thank you.
Any questions, John? Yes.
Just what I know nothing about DNA, except that I know that Richard's DNA was compared. I think he was a carpenter in Canada.
That's it, yes.
Through the female line, and with the Duke of Buccleuch, not Buccleuch, Duke of Badminton, Duke of the guy who owns Badminton House. Anyway, whatever. It was, and it was proved also that he was no more the Duke than I am, because there was there'd been a bit of wayward activity on the way. But I couldn't understand why. Can they not go up the line, because they know where his mother's buried? They're in Fotheringay Church, aren't they?
Yes,
family. And Edward IV sin wins at St George's Chapel. So could they not compare that? They seem to go to an awful lot of effort.
I know what you mean, but
Yeah.
you get 2 lots of DNA. I'm on dodgy ground here because I'm not a scientist or a historian, but the mitochondrial DNA is the one that goes on the female line, and that gives us a positive lead, and they can follow that. The male line does zoom about all over the place. but it was a lot easier to do it that way. You could get into all sorts of blind alleys, dead ends and things by following one route, but follow that line, you can get a definite match.
Me too. That was very entertaining, thank you. You didn't mention the Duke of Clarence.
Yes, well, I keep the narrative to Richard. Clarence was the middle brother. He had Edward of York, Clarence, and then Richard. He was a bit of a nuisance. He kept changing sides all the time. He's a chap who was drowned in a barrel of Malmsey wine. You know, Edward found him guilty of treason, and he said, "Because you're my brother, I'll let you choose your way of dying." He said, "Oh, drown me in a barrel of wine." So he did. But yeah, no, I prefer to stick just to Richard and his story. Once you start branching off there, it could be all night.
Yeah.
Makes the Harry and Meghan a bit simple, doesn't it?
It does, yes.
It sounds
Oh, listen, when you get involved
what a
with
royal family.
royal families, family trees, all the successions, all the crossovers, things, oh, it's a nightmare. Oh,
Con Eagledon or Eagledon, however you
Con
pronounce
Eagledon,
it,
yeah.
yeah. So he always has very large historical notes. And he famously did the trilogy about the Wars of the Roses. I think it's 4 books in that.
4 books, yeah.
Yeah. I think somewhere he mentioned that it wouldn't be uncommon for somebody in a royal bloodline to have pronounced right side muscles, because from an early part of their childhood, they're practicing the sword sometimes for hours a day. And I think he mentioned that when he was anointed, there was no particular mention of the scoliosis, but they would have been used to seeing the right side overly pinched, basically.
Yeah, I know what you mean, yeah.
The weight of the sword. It's just an interesting development that his disability or physical effect might not have been as pronounced in his lifetime as we think.
No, it would have been noticeably. There are people around today who have scoliosis, and you have to look carefully. But once you spot it, yeah, you're a little bit out of kilter. It was exactly the same with Richard. He probably had armour made to take this into account as well.
Yeah.
And as for people fighting right arms more developed, you know, a blacksmith skeleton from the Middle Ages would have stronger muscle development on the right hand side for all the work he did.
Yes.
The archers' skeletons they found on the Mary Rose, you could tell they were archers by the way they'd stretch and it affected their backs. So a lot of physical information like that can be extracted, tells you a lot about the person's lifestyle. As I say, Richard, the skeleton, he did have scoliosis. It would have thrown him out of kilter. You would have to look for it to spot it.
That was fantastic. I so enjoyed that, and without any sort of illustrations. Do you know as much about another historical figure so you could come and tell us?
There's that fella, what's his name? Fella who wrote the plays. Him. I do a talk on the death of kings. Shakespeare's kings, from King John to King Henry VIII, about each of their lives, and in particular, the way they died, and how those deaths are represented on stage in Shakespeare's plays, and how those stage deaths differ from what happened originally. But starting with King John, ending with Henry VIII, yeah, I do a talk about that.
Do you do one on our own Glendower?
I don't know. There's a very shadowy character. I do a talk about Shakespeare's Welsh characters and all the Welsh connections, the people in his plays, the people he knew in Stratford.
Yes.
Tons of Welsh people living in Stratford in Shakespeare's time. The Welsh people he met in court in London. So I do a talk about Shakespeare's Welsh connections there, which involves Owen Dundar.
John, can you come back in October, please?
Any specific dates?
Phone Monday.
Don't think of doing anything that day. I've got my diary, Jan, you'll have a look. Oh, sorry.
Yes, we are, of course, the Stratford Society, and we anticipate that all of talks here will bear some relation to the town and to what goes on in the town. So can you explain the relationship between Richard III and Stratford?
Yes, well, as I mentioned, that fellow Shakespeare, he did write a play called Richard III. So there's is a connection there. Now, we know Richard visited Warwick, Coventry. As far as we know, he never actually visited Stratford.
I can suggest one thing. Our man Hugh Clopton,
Right, yes.
1484-5, was the warden of the livery company of the Mercers in London.
Yes.
The most powerful of all the London companies. He was, as warden, he was sent on a trade mission sent by Richard III to negotiate with the Duke of Burgundy over restriction of trade. There was kind of a Trumpian negotiation about tariffs and import duties. After Hugh Clopton came back, he was found to be breaking his own embargo by trying to import £3,000 worth of mercery into England, which was completely out of Clopton's character. And there's a suggestion that the king himself might have inveigled Hugh Clopton to do that in an underhanded way. This blighted the remaining 10 years of Clopton's life, and trying to expiate his sins as he perceived them, he spent all of his fortune mostly on improving the buildings in the town of Stratford.
Yeah, okay, I shall keep to that one, thank you.
Certainly put a lot of money in the town still.
There's no more questions, and I think that's. So I don't think when I ask people to do talks, I ask them because I think the talks are going to be interesting, not necessarily centred upon Stratford upon Avon, but which for most of its history was, you know, a small market town, let's face it. And it's only because of one chap that we're known anywhere. So, you know, if somebody comes and says, oh, somebody's got a lovely talk about the life and death of Richard III, I think, well, that sounds interesting. And I think it was very interesting.